Gases in the welding industry are all pressurized, and they're available in different sized cylinders. Each cylinder must be clearly labeled to show the cylinder testing date, and often it will show the gas distributor's name as well. Each gas cylinder must also be labeled to indicate exactly which gas is stored in it, as well as the type of hazard that may be represented. Now, some gases represent a combination of hazards, and there's no industry standard for color coding of industrial gas cylinders. So here's an important safety reminder. Always check the cylinder label. Now let's talk about some of the other safety rules for handling pressurized cylinders. The first item on our checklist is, when they're not secured, cylinders should always be capped to protect the cylinder's valve. If a highly pressurized cylinder were to fall without the valve protected, the valve itself could break off. And with the high pressure being expelled from the cylinder valve, it could be propelled like a powerful torpedo in any direction, creating a very dangerous situation. Well, now we have a few more things to add to our checklist. For example, cylinders must always be stored in the vertical position, with the valve end up, especially acetylene tanks. Next, cylinders should never be transported in an enclosed vehicle. If a leak develops, there may not be adequate ventilation, and leaking flammable gases create an explosive atmosphere. We know that oxygen by itself doesn't burn, but as we've seen, oxygen does lower kindling temperatures and accelerates combustion. And of course, high purity oxygen will not only support, but also amplify combustion. So, when you're not using them, be sure to store flammable cylinders at least 20 feet away from oxygen cylinders. Or even better, separate them by a properly designed firewall. When you're actually operating oxy-fuel equipment, we know that danger is always present, as well as the potential for a disastrous accident. So let's cover some of the safety issues that you should keep in mind whenever you use gas cylinders. During operation, always be sure to keep sparks from coming in contact with the fuel gas cylinders. If a leak is present somewhere in the system, of course, this can cause a fire. For example, it's possible for the cylinder valve packing to leak, and that means a fire is just waiting to happen. It's also important never to strike an arc on any cylinder with any arc welding device. This can cause a weak spot in the cylinder, or worse, cause nearby flammable gases to explode. Remember, all fuel gases represent a flammable hazard. Acetylene, for example, is the most unstable of the fuel gases. It should never be used at pressures above 15 pounds per square inch. If acetylene is compressed outside the cylinder at pressures greater than 15 psi, the gas becomes unstable and may result in what is known as a dissociative explosion, and we definitely want to avoid that. To explain this a little further, let's talk about how an acetylene cylinder is constructed. First of all, the cylinder itself is filled with a porous absorbent material, which is then saturated with liquid acetone. These components help keep the gas stable under pressure in the cylinder. Here's a simple demonstration. This plastic bottle is filled with colored water. You can see that the air creates a barrier between the water and the neck of the bottle. Well, if the acetylene cylinder is laid on its side, the acetone liquid can fill the valve area and then may be released into the regulator when it's used. Remember that acetone can damage the equipment and starve the flame, which in turn may cause the tip to overheat. If that happens, the result could be what's called a flashback. A flashback can be a very dangerous situation, and we'll be discussing that more completely a little later on. So remember, if at all possible, never lay an acetylene cylinder on its side. Always keep it in an upright position. If you do find that it's absolutely necessary, though, to lay an acetylene cylinder on its side, you should then allow that cylinder to stand in the upright position for at least twice as long as it was on its side. Next, let's talk about oxygen. By itself, we know that oxygen is not flammable. It is, however, an oxidizer with pressures that can exceed 2200 psi in a fully charged cylinder. And here's something that may surprise you. Contrary to popular belief, high-pressure oxygen, not fuel gas, is responsible for a majority of the accidents that occur with oxy-fuel equipment. Therefore, it's important to remember never completely empty the entire contents of the cylinder. Instead, be sure to leave a minimum of 20 psi in the cylinder. This will help prevent the possible reverse flow of the opposite gas into that cylinder. And be sure that no oils, grease, or lubricants are allowed to come in contact with the oxygen cylinder or valve. We'll go into greater detail on that a little later as well.